Right. We now need to look at the topic 15, which looks at the environment. So one key concept here is that energy flows from the sun to the producers and then to consumers. So this point here highlights the importance of the sun as the principal source of energy input to biological systems. What this implies is that all biological systems, the producers, the consumers, they are all getting their energy from the sun. The sun is the principal source of energy into these biological systems. There are some definitions that we also need to note. We need to appreciate the fact that a food chain shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the next. We also need to appreciate the fact that a food chain begins with a producer. So you should never draw a food chain that starts with the sun. You should never draw a food chain that begins with a consumer. Your food chain should begin with a producer. You are also expected to differentiate between a food chain and a food web. So a food chain will just show a lineup of organisms, a lineup of one producer and a couple of consumers. Unlike a food chain, a food web is a network of interconnected food chains. So you get a food web when you combine different types of food chains. Now, a food web is actually much more accurate in representing the feeding relationships of organisms because it appreciates the fact that one organism does not simply feed on one other thing. If you take a look at us human beings, we've got a very rich diet. We feed on different types of things. Okay, so a food web is a better representation of that. Right. So we also need to appreciate that a producer is an organism that usually uses energy from sunlight to make its own organic nutrients through photosynthesis. So that first organism in a food chain should be a producer. It should be an organism that is able to make its own energy. Right? It should be an organism that is able to make its own food through photosynthesis. So unlike a producer, consumers cannot make their own food. They depend on producers for nutrition. Okay, not all consumers will depend on producers, but a primary consumer will depend on a producer. The secondary and tertiary and quaternary consumers do not depend on producers. Right, so a consumer is an organism that gets its energy by feeding on other organisms. Consumers may be classed as primary, secondary, and tertiary according to their position in a food chain. A herbivore is an animal that gets its energy by eating plants. We have two types of herbivores. We've got grazers, which eat grass, and then we've got browsers, which eat leaves. A carnivore is an animal that gets its energy by eating other animals. A decomposer is an organism that gets its energy from dead or waste organic matter. The dead or waste organic matter can be either plant or animal matter. An ecosystem is a unit which contains the community of organisms and their environment interacting together. A lake is an example of an ecosystem. A trophic level is the position of an organism in a food chain or in a food web. On the left-hand side, I've got a food web. On the right-hand side, I also have a food web. Now take a look here. This is the producer in this food web. In this food web here, we've got these producers here. Right, so these ones here can be referred to as the primary consumers because they directly feed on the producer. The grasshopper and the squirrel can also be referred to as primary consumers by virtue of their position and by virtue of the fact that they directly feed on the producer. Right. So we also have other secondary consumers. So a single organism can also be a secondary or a tertiary consumer by virtue of its position in a food web. Okay. To explain this further, we can take a look at the fox. If we follow this pathway here, we'll go from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer. So using this pathway, the fox is a tertiary consumer. But if we use this pathway here, we'll go from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer. The fox would be a secondary consumer using this pathway over here. Now take a look at the arrows. They point away and they show the transfer of energy. So when the grasshopper feeds on these plants here, energy will be transferred from the plant to the grasshopper. That's why the arrow is pointing forward. When the scorpion feeds on the grasshopper, energy is transferred from the grasshopper to the scorpion. Right, so we also have something known as pyramids of energy. Now, pyramids of energy represent the total energy in the various trophic levels of a food chain. So producers occupy the first trophic level, and then after these producers, we can have primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. It's important to highlight that producers occupy the first trophic level, and this trophic level has the largest amount of energy, as you can see there. The quantity of energy which is available to the next trophic level decreases from one trophic level to the next. Food chains and food webs are used to show the transfer of energy. The arrows should point in the direction of the consumer or in the forward direction. We've already looked at food webs. Now let's take a look at food chains. As you can see, the food chains begin with producers. A tree and grass, these two are producers. The arrows will point in the forward direction to show that when a caterpillar feeds on the tree, energy will move from the tree to the caterpillar. Right, so this process here of energy transfer is not very effective because remember, the caterpillar will respire, the caterpillar will defecate, the caterpillar will urinate. That waste which goes to the ground also takes energy to the ground. Are we there? So energy will be lost as we go from one trophic level to the next due to processes like urination, defecation, respiration, etc., etc. Okay. And besides, sometimes when let's say if you've got a hawk which is feeding on the bird, the hawk might not feed on the whole bird. It might leave out maybe the beak or other parts, meaning that the energy contained in these parts which are not fed on will be lost to the environment. Right. So the movement of energy from one trophic level to the other one is not 100% efficient. Some energy is lost along the way. So just to reaffirm, primary consumers feed on producers directly. They are called herbivores. Secondary consumers are carnivores that eat herbivores. Tertiary consumers are carnivores that eat other carnivores. Right, when it comes to organisms and their environment, we need to also appreciate the impact humans have through overharvesting of food species and through introducing foreign species to a habitat. So humans can alter food webs through overharvesting food species and also by introducing foreign species to habitats. Overharvesting will damage food chains as other organisms which consume the food being overharvested will no longer have enough food to survive, meaning that many of them will die. Introducing foreign species may have the same effect as there is now competition for resources which could affect the native species. The foreign species might also overhunt native species that do not evolve or adapt to protect themselves. So these native species, they are not used to having, you know, a particular type of predator. They have not evolved to protect themselves against such a predator. So that means that this predator will kill this particular, you know, indigenous species. It will kill it in large numbers, leading to extinction. Right, so this can ultimately disrupt the food chain by leading to the extinction of those organisms or other organisms that actually depend on these organisms as their primary food source. So we can look at the story of the dodo, which was a flightless bird, which was found in Mauritius. So this was a bird that was native to the island of Mauritius. So the introduction of invasive species such as pigs, rats, and monkeys is believed to have contributed to the extinction of the dodo, because these exotic species, these invasive species, preyed upon the dodo's eggs and chicks. They led to habitat destruction, and then they caused the dodo to become extinct. The carbon cycle is the process by which carbon is exchanged between the atmosphere, oceans, land, and living things. It's a vital process that supports life on Earth. This diagram here represents the carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide in air and water can move into carbon in plants through photosynthesis. The carbon in plants can move into carbon dioxide in air and water through respiration. Carbon in plants can move into carbon in animals through feeding. The carbon in animals can become carbon dioxide in air and water through respiration. Fossil fuels can also be burnt to release carbon dioxide in air and water through combustion. Carbon in plants can become carbon in dead organic matter through death or excretion. The carbon in animals can also become carbon in dead organic matter through death or excretion. The carbon in dead organic matter can be fossilized to form fossil fuels through the process known as fossilization. The carbon in dead organic matter can be decomposed through decomposition by decomposers. So all this here shows the carbon cycle. It shows the process by which carbon is exchanged between the atmosphere, oceans, land, and living things. And remember that this process is very, very important for supporting life on Earth. Now, to elaborate, the process photosynthesis is necessary because plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Right. So when they absorb carbon dioxide, these plants will use this carbon dioxide to make glucose. Respiration is also important because plants or animals use oxygen to break down glucose and release energy as well as carbon dioxide. So here we're looking at carbon dioxide because we are expanding on the carbon cycle. So feeding, with regards to feeding, carbon passes through the food chain in food. With regards to decomposition, microorganisms break down dead organisms, releasing carbon dioxide. As for fossilization, plant or animal remains can become fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, petroleum, or crude oil. Right. Last but not least, we can take a look at combustion, which releases carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels. An ecosystem can be described as a unit containing the community of organisms and their environment interacting together. So an ecosystem is a unit containing a community of organisms. So we have a community of organisms